I know of no particularly interesting new thoughts. Noam Chomsky. He has been an American linguist, philosopher, political scientist, and activist of Jewish origin. He is Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I know of no particularly interesting new thoughts. What connections are there between your academic and intellectual production in the field of linguistics and your political opinions? Connections can be of many kinds. Historical, there are none. My political views were already taking shape long before I heard of linguistics, and what I studied in later years at university was a kind of descriptive technology with, in my opinion, few wider implications. In the various structuralist movements there were frequent attempts to broaden these ideas, but the result of all this is, I think, very weak and unconvincing. In any case, it had no influence on me. As far as logical connections, there aren't any either, as far as I can see. There are, however, some more tenuous and abstract links that can be traced back to the Enlightenment, when thinkers like Rousseau and Humboldt attempted to link questions of freedom and the roots of human knowledge, action, and understanding, in particular, in connection with language. I have ever written about these interesting and suggestive ideas. Generally speaking, we have no choice but to take positions on political issues, whether we are revolutionaries, reformists, supporters of the status quo or simply apathetic, in the latter case adopting a political position according to which the fate of human beings is none of our business. Each of these positions is based on some beliefs, perhaps only tacit, about the human consequences of the position adopted and its importance. A serious and rational person will try, as far as possible, to base such beliefs on the facts. We know too little about humans to be able to do that with any degree of confidence, but we can at least try. We can try to develop our beliefs in a way that allows them to be subjected to thought, analysis, criticism and questioning. Ultimately, those beliefs about human nature and the ways in which it manifests itself, perhaps damaged or distorted, in specific social institutions and circumstances. Libertarian attitudes will be, and historically have been, based on the belief that a kind of freedom instinct is essential in human nature, a desire to be free, from any arbitrary external authority, to be able to exercise their own abilities to ask, create, understand, play, etc., through free choice and in free association with others. The world is anew complex and these instincts, if they are real, do not exhaust the space for moral and responsible social action required by all kinds of compromises and adaptations. But those who are serious in their critique of authority and hierarchy must assume that such a set of needs and rights is at the core of human nature. We know little about these issues and, therefore, we depend largely on intuition, experience, and hopes. But cognitively we do know something, and what we do know tells us that the most distinctive aspects of human intelligence, especially the ability to speak, are rooted in some remarkable mechanisms, unique to humans, that we know of, that provide the means for what has sometimes been called the creative aspect of language use, the normal use of language to express one's thoughts in a way that is unlimited in breadth, gratuitous in appearance yet coherent and appropriate, as well as evocative in the listener of thoughts that could have been expressed in a similar way. For the Cartesians, these properties were the clearest proof that another creature has a mind like ours. We are far from understanding them well, but at least we know something about them. And it is possible that further understanding will lead to links to other aspects of free and creative action and their roots in human nature, perhaps even to the rudiments of a libertarian social theory based on some real understanding of human nature. These prospects are remote, but some of the issues seem to be on the horizon, and there are exciting ideas as to how this might play out. If this path can be followed productively, it might be possible to elaborate certain links between language and freedom, perhaps of the kind that have given rise to interesting speculation since at least the Enlightenment. I would like to stress again that every political position, and we cannot avoid adopting such positions, is based on, at the very least, tacit assumptions about human nature. We need to be as clear as possible on the issue, if only so that others can properly interpret our position. What I have just briefly noted is one of those points of view that must be developed and valued together with others. Those who believe that they are not adopting some of these points of view are deluding themselves. What are the general prospects for anarchism after the end of the post-Stalinist regimes in Eastern Europe? The perspectives have improved a lot, as they improved after the collapse of fascism. The fall of any system of tyranny and domination improves the prospects for freedom. However, we must recognize that the dominant forces of global society do not seek to enlarge the scope of freedom. Rather, its goal is, and has been for 70 years, to return Eastern Europe to its traditional service role, a kind of Latin Americanization of the region. This is exactly what we are witnessing, and also what has been predicted. The old nomenclatura is happily putting itself in a position to assume the role of third world elites, who enrich themselves through association with foreign masters while the population sinks into suffering and misery. The prospects for freedom may exist, but they will not come without a fight, in Eastern Europe or elsewhere. American society is an unusual society in many respects. Enjoy unique privileges. After the extermination or displacement of the native population, the settlers who arrived were able to dispose of enormous wealth. The United States remains the richest country in the world, with incomparable advantages. The fact that it ranks far behind industrial societies in indices of social well-being is just one of many signs of the catastrophic human consequences of capitalism. In rich societies there is no true capitalist system because the owners and managers demand to be defended from its ravages, but its elements can be found in varying degrees. The United States sits toward the capitalist end of the state capitalist spectrum, and the social costs are obvious. While it is, in many respects, the freest society in the world, it is also exceptional for the unchallenged power and dominance of the business classes, who have always had a high-class consciousness and have known that they must fight a continuous and bitter war of classes to prevent the population in general from making use of the freedoms conquered. The intellectual class, as might be expected, largely serves these interests, so the spectrum of articulated ideology skews quite sharply to the right. This is true, in particular, of libertarian thought. In the United States, unlike the rest of the world, libertarians, liberals, are advocates of pure capitalism, ranging from Friedmanists who believe that it is the job of government to serve the needs of the rich, of course, they say other forms, to the most extreme libertarians who oppose roads, schools, and any social action that violates the freedom to get rich. I emphasize again that the owners and managers of society would never tolerate capitalist forms for a moment and that they have always resorted to state force to protect themselves, regulate unruly markets, guarantee a public subsidy and a state-supported market for excess of production and increase in many other ways their wealth and privileges. But libertarian ideologies are nonetheless useful. The anarcho-capitalist doctrine can be used as a weapon against social spending that could benefit the general population, though it is quickly brushed aside when it comes to subsidizing high-tech industry through the Pentagon system, crushing independence of the third world so that cheap labor and resources are available for the needs of wealthy investors, etc. In much the same way, the rich societies of the world impose on the South the doctrines of IMF fundamentalism, which they themselves have always rejected, and continue to reject, which is why they are rich and prosperous. As for my relationship with American libertarians, it is complex. I have many good friends in those groups and there is a shared range of beliefs, convictions, and moral principles. I am not talking about the pure cynics, who use these ideas as a battering ram against others, but about people who take them seriously, in the wrong way in my opinion. More specifically, we tend to agree about state violence. For a few years, the only newspapers I was able to publish in America were the right-wing libertarians. However, we disagree on more fundamental issues and often on political issues. Right-wing libertarianism, and doctrinally fashionable free trade capitalism in general, in my opinion, are a gross perversion of classical liberal thought, stripped of essential intellectual and moral content and often completely misrepresented, it is the fate of Adam Smith in the doctrinal system. It's a good example. Classical liberalism was founded on the doctrines of human freedom that I alluded to earlier. He opposed the arbitrary power and coercion represented, at that time, by the absolutist state, the feudal system, religious authority, state-supported mercantile empires, etc. In later times, new forms of centralized power emerged, especially the corporate industrial financial system, a set of institutions whose internal structure is completely totalitarian, in which orders run from the top down and leave individuals the choice of renting to the masters or starve. Furthermore, these institutions have accumulated an unprecedented power that has allowed them to undermine democratic institutions, isolate and marginalize the population, control the ideological system and use it for their purposes, and so on. We are now facing a new stage in the process, as a de facto world government takes shape reflecting the interests of the transnational corporations and financial institutions that dominate the world economy, a government beyond influence and conscience even the general public. Certainly there are and always have been counter-trends. But what I am saying is that if we apply the basic thinking of classical liberalism to the modern age, we will end up strongly confronted with these new systems of power and domination, and we will try to overcome and dissolve them to expand the realm of freedom. The heirs of classical liberalism are, in my opinion, the libertarian socialists. In this, it is obvious, I radically dissent from American capitalist libertarianism, which, if realized, would give rise to a system of tyranny, oppression, misery, and mutual hatred beyond anything conceivable. Fortunately, there is no chance that such doctrines will come to fruition, because the masters would never allow it, for reasons explained years ago by Karl Polanyi and others. What are today, in the current political economic situation, the main social and ideological axes of resistance? With the acceleration that has occurred in the last 20 years in the globalization of the economy, it is becoming increasingly possible for industrial companies to move production to areas of high repression and low wages and to resort to the most selective application of neoliberal doctrine to destroy community values, environmental standards, and human life in general. One consequence is that industrial societies themselves are beginning to adopt certain aspects of the Third World, moving towards the dual Third World model, with islands of extreme wealth and privilege in a sea of misery and despair. We can see these processes in the United States, in many ways the most advanced industrial society with the most sophisticated business classes. Europe, in my opinion, is not far behind. Much of the population is going to become superfluous in terms of wealth production, and much less will be needed than before in market terms. Production can be carried out by the overexploited poor, and the market will be made up of the rich sectors of international societies, small groups in the Third World, instead of large sectors in the richest societies. There is no doubt that these tendencies must be resisted. This means, first of all, efforts to reverse the remarkable deterioration of democratic forms in industrial societies, where large parts of the population are increasingly marginalized and removed from active participation in influencing public affairs, and even of your knowledge. In the last 30 years in particular, there has been a considerable increase in the cultural and moral level among the general population, especially in the United States, with a much greater concern for racist and sexist oppression, the rights of future generations, and the issues ecological in general, more respect for other cultures, opposition to state violence, all of which have become so strong that the U.S. government no longer has the recourse to classic intervention, and knows it very well. However, these events have little institutional form. They must become more than thoughts in the heads of isolated people, or the concerns of very local and widespread grassroots organizations. The potential exists for large and effective social movements committed to peace, justice, and truth. But realizing this potential will not be an easy task. What is your conception of power? Do you find Foucault's work on this topic interesting? I am afraid I am not too impressed by almost everything that is produced in the field of social theory. The little that is given in these subjects seems vastly simple. I recognize that intellectuals need careers and therefore have to recast simple thoughts in obscure terminology and difficulty. But I'm not sure there's much behind all that complex talk. Sorry to seem harsh. Maybe it's not fair. But that's my feeling. As for power, I have nothing to say beyond the obvious. In various social structures and institutions, some are in a position to influence and coerce, others are subject to their decisions and choices, to varying degrees. They are power relations. They take many forms, they rarely have any justification, although sometimes they can. I exercise power if I stop my 3-year-old granddaughter from crossing the street, but that exercise can be justified. In most cases, it is not possible, in my opinion. I do not pretend that these observations are profound. In reality, they are trivial. It takes a lot of research and study to apply simple ideas to complex real-world situations. Part of Foucault's work, once disentangled from the obscurantism of its presentation, seems to me interesting and enlightening in this sense. Much more, I must say, than much of what has come out of the curious culture of Paris in the post-war years. What new contemporary ideas have a greater emancipatory value? I don't know of any particularly interesting new thoughts. Perhaps I could be branded as conservative, one of the few perhaps in the contemporary world. I think the ideals of the Enlightenment were often valid. They were not, of course, created de novo, but they have a rich and important history. They can be, and to some extent have been, sharpened and improved, and must be adapted to entirely new conditions and circumstances. The modern era is marked by a great deal of pontification, careerism, self-interested polysyllabic obfuscation, and the like, reflecting the opportunities available to intellectuals in the contemporary period and the social needs they can satisfy in the service of power. But if there are new and surprising ideas, I have missed them. How do you consider the new paradigms that are emerging in epistemology, Rorty's anti-foundationalism, etc., and system theories, complexity of self-organizing systems? Prigozhin, Atlan, von Foerster, in short. Are they useful to you in your work and political thinking? In a word, not much. They are not new paradigms. Anti-foundationalism was rooted in the 17th century, as a response to the skeptical crisis of the time. The issue is well discussed in one of the leading contemporary historians of ideas, Richard Popkin, who observes that Mersenne and Gassendi's constructive skepticism recognized that there are no firm foundations for knowledge, but nevertheless we have rules for assessing the reliability and applicability of what we have discovered about the world, in essence the position of post-Newtonian science. Kant clarified the point of view, and it is a commonplace of modern thought. I don't want to suggest that Rorty et al. Don't have anything new to say on these issues, sometimes they do, but there are new paradigms here. As far as systems theory is concerned, various contributions to it have to be judged on their own merits. In some areas, there may be merits, but there are no major general contributions that I know of. The study of complexity is interesting. I have followed this work to some extent, including some doctoral research at MIT, and I think it opens some new doors. The study of self-organizing systems is also of some interest. But, in my opinion, the belief that they are new paradigms with some broader scope is simply wrong. There are dozens of similar new developments, many of them more interesting than that, at least to me. New ideas do not come easily. Outside the sciences they are, in fact, rare, and those that develop within the natural and formal sciences very rarely have implications beyond their own formulation. They are worth understanding, just as good music is worth listening to. But they are not likely to help us gain a deep understanding of the problems we face in our personal and social lives, the real problems of human existence. Intellectuals naturally have an interest in asserting the opposite, but we have to be careful to distinguish between intellectual fashion and intellectual content, two quite different things. The Spanish Civil War, collectivizations. You had a tough confrontation with Gabriel Jackson. Is that relevant today? Why his strong feelings on the subject at the time? My interest in the Spanish Revolution, which was an element of the Civil War, goes back 50 years. As soon as I was old enough to travel alone, I spent many hours in New York's anarchist hangouts and second-hand bookstores with some of the most interesting political documents and materials, and, quite often, a very active intellectual life. I managed to collect a good amount of documentation that was not published until the 1970s. The popular revolution that swept through much of Spain was an extremely important moment in modern history. As a mass popular movement, it had many flaws, but it also reached levels of libertarian achievement that have yet to be equaled, which is why it quickly became a target of the coalition of communists, fascists, and Western democracies that could not tolerate it and stifled it. To then deal with the secondary question of who will be left with the spoils, the Civil War itself. I did not have occasion to write on this subject until the late 1960s, in the context of the growing popular movements of the time, which had a libertarian component, but were completely divorced from history, not surprising, since the story had been largely hidden and, at that time, was practically unknown. The achievements of the workers and peasants of Spain were important then, as they are now. That's why I wrote about them. By the way, it is much easier now than it was 25 years ago to write about these issues. Much unpublished documentation has been published and there is a fairly good specialized literature, which was almost non-existent back then. It's not entirely accurate to say that I had a tough run-in with Gabriel Jackson. I chose your book for discussion because I found it to be the most thoughtful, sensitive, insightful, and informed study of the day. So I dedicated myself to see how he had treated the events of the late 1930s. It seemed to me, and I tried to show, that he approached these events from a position very contrary to the popular revolutions, that he adopted what was then the normal communist liberal attitude towards the Spanish Revolution. I tried to show that hidden biases led to considerable distortion of the facts. It was a model example in a broader inquiry into the hidden and unspoken biases of liberal scholarship, which was wrong in its particular pursuits of objectivity. I do not criticize the book for harboring bias, but for harboring unacknowledged bias. Everyone has their point of view, and you should try to make it as clear as possible. Others will judge how convincing my argument was. But the reasons why I was interested in the Spanish Revolution are exactly the same reasons that stimulated my interest 30 years before, and continue to be so today. There is much to learn from these struggles, as George Orwell, among others, eloquently reflected at the time. Finish. I know of no particularly interesting new thoughts. Noam Chomsky.